The airport was a sea of activity, with travelers moving in every direction, dragging suitcases and clutching passports. The air buzzed with announcements and the distant hum of jet engines. In the middle of this bustling scene, a young black girl stood quietly near the check-in counter, her gaze steady yet calm. She wore a simple outfit, a hoodie, jeans and sneakers, that made her blend into the crowd. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything other than a typical passenger. But appearances can be deceiving. As she adjusted the strap of her small backpack, two police officers entered the terminal, their eyes scanning the crowd. One of them, Officer Brad Thompson, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a demeanor that radiated authority. His partner, Officer Sarah Mitchell, was smaller in stature, but sharp-eyed and focused. They had received a tip about suspicious activity, and their target was supposedly somewhere in this terminal. It wasn't long before Brad's gaze locked on the girl. She stood alone, calm yet alert, and something about her piqued his interest. He nudged Sarah, nodding subtly in the girl's direction. "Her," Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "She fits the description," Brad replied, already moving toward her. The girl noticed them immediately, her sharp eyes flicking toward the approaching officers. Her expression didn't change, but there was a momentary stiffness in her posture, a fleeting signal that she understood what was happening. The officers reached her within seconds. Brad took the lead, his voice firm but polite. "Excuse me, miss. Can we speak with you for a moment?" The girl turned to face them fully. Up close, she appeared younger than Brad had initially guessed. No older than 17. She nodded without hesitation. "Sure. What's this about?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Brad, silently assessing the girl's calm demeanor. Most people, when approached by law enforcement, displayed some mix of nerves or defensiveness. But this girl seemed completely unshaken. "We just need to ask you a few questions," Brad said, his tone neutral. "Can I see some ID?" The girl reached into her pocket and handed over a small card. Brad examined it, noting the name, Naomi Taylor. Nothing about the name rang any bells, but he wasn't convinced. "Where are you headed, Naomi?" Sarah asked, stepping in now. "Home," Naomi replied simply. "I was visiting my aunt, and now I'm flying back." Her answers were direct, and her tone was steady, but Brad couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. He glanced at her backpack. "Mind if we take a look at your bag?" Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment. A pause so slight it was almost imperceptible, before nodding. "Go ahead." Brad unzipped the backpack, his movements methodical as he inspected the contents. A book, a water bottle, a phone charger, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, her voice still calm, but with an edge of curiosity. Before Brad could answer, Sarah spoke up. "We're just being thorough. Routine check." By now, the exchange had caught the attention of nearby travelers. People slowed down as they passed, their eyes flicking between the officers and the young girl. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, and Naomi noticed. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice louder now, carrying over the growing murmur of onlookers. "We're not saying you have," Brad replied, his tone firm but slightly defensive. Sarah touched Brad's arm, signaling for him to ease off. But the tension had already escalated. Brad gestured toward a quieter area near the security checkpoint. "Let's step over here and talk." Naomi glanced at the gathering crowd before nodding. She picked up her backpack and followed the officers, her head held high. The onlookers watched as the trio moved away, their curiosity evident. Once they were out of earshot of the crowd, Sarah turned to Naomi. "Do you know why we might have stopped you?" Naomi shook her head. "No, I don't. You're the ones who approached me." Brad folded his arms, his expression skeptical. "Are you sure about that? Nothing you want to tell us?" Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "I don't know what you're looking for, but you're not going to find it with me." There was something in her tone, not defiance, but quiet confidence that unsettled Brad. It wasn't the kind of confidence you'd expect from a teenager being questioned by police. Sarah decided to change tactics. Naomi, we're just trying to do our job here. If there's anything you think we should know, now's the time to tell us. Naomi sighed softly, her eyes flicking between the two officers. I've told you everything. I'm just trying to catch my flight. Brad glanced at Sarah, unsure of their next move. They didn't have enough to detain her, but something still didn't sit right. Then, almost as if on cue, Brad's radio crackled to life. Thompson Mitchell, we've got an update, came the voice from dispatch. Brad raised the radio to his mouth. Go ahead. You're not going to believe this, the voice continued. That girl you were talking to, she's not who she seems. We just got confirmation on her ID. Stand by for more details. Brad's heart skipped a beat as he exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Sarah. Naomi, meanwhile, stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. What's going on? She asked, her voice calm, but with a hint of curiosity. Brad lowered the radio, his gaze locking onto hers. We're about to find out. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Naomi remained composed, but the officers could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. Whatever the dispatch had discovered, it was about to change everything. And in that moment, the bustling airport around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the three of them locked in an uncertain standoff. Brad's grip tightened on the radio as the dispatch voice echoed in his ears. He glanced at Naomi again, his mind racing. Who exactly was this girl? And why had she suddenly become the focus of such urgent attention? Naomi, for her part, remained remarkably composed. If she was nervous, she hid it well. Her eyes held steady on the officers, sharp and observant, as though she were studying them just as much as they were studying her. Why didn't you just tell me what's going on? She asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Brad hesitated. The truth was, he didn't have a clear answer, yet, but he wasn't about to reveal that uncertainty. We're waiting for clarification, he said curtly, hoping it would buy him a little more time. Sarah, sensing the mounting pressure, decided to try a different approach. Naomi, she said gently, her voice softer now, we're not trying to scare you. But sometimes people aren't always upfront about who they are. If there's something you need to share, we can work this out. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. You keep saying that, but I don't know what you're expecting me to say. I've been honest with you. Brad frowned. Her calm demeanor was starting to bother him. Most people would have cracked under this kind of scrutiny, at least showing a flicker of fear or frustration. But Naomi, she was like a closed book, her emotions tightly guarded. The radio crackled again, breaking the silence. This time, the voice from dispatch sounded more urgent. Thompson Mitchell, are you with the girl right now? Brad responded immediately. Yes, we've got her. What's going on? There was a brief pause before the voice replied. We need you to hold her there. Do not let her leave. We're sending someone to the scene now with further instructions. Brad's pulse quickened. The instructions were clear, but the lack of details only made the situation more unsettling. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who looked just as uneasy. Naomi crossed her arms, her expression cool but curious. Looks like you've got some kind of mystery to solve, she said, her tone light, but with an edge of sarcasm. Sarah decided to press further. Naomi, you said you were visiting your aunt. Can you tell us a little more about her? Where does she live? What's her name? Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name's Patricia. She lives in Atlanta. Why? Do you think she's involved in whatever you're imagining this is? Sarah ignored the deflection and pushed on. And what about your parents? Where are they? My mum's back home, waiting for me, Naomi replied. My dad passed away a few years ago. Her tone was even, almost rehearsed, and it only deepened Sarah's suspicion. Something about Naomi didn't add up. But before Sarah could ask another question, Brad's radio buzzed again. Units are en route, dispatch said. ETA 5 minutes. Keep her contained until then. The word contained made Brad's stomach twist. This was starting to feel less like a routine stop and more like something far bigger. But what could a teenager possibly have done to warrant this level of attention? Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her movements deliberate and calm. She seemed to sense the growing tension. But instead of panicking, she appeared almost amused. "You're acting like I'm some kind of criminal," she said. "But you haven't even told me what you think I've done." Brad exhaled slowly, trying to keep his frustration in check. "We're just following orders." "Orders from who?" Naomi shot back. Her voice was still calm, but there was a sharpness to it now, a challenge. "You don't even know, do you?" Sarah stepped in before Brad could respond. "Naomi, this isn't a game. If there's something going on here, you need to help us understand." Naomi's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I told you, I'm just trying to get home. Whatever you think you know about me, it's wrong." The sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Brad turned to see a man in a dark suit striding toward them, flanked by 2 more officers. The man's expression was serious, and his presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. "Thompson. Mitchell," the man said, addressing them directly. "I'm Agent Carter, FBI." Brad's eyebrows shot up in surprise. FBI. Whatever this was, it had officially escalated beyond anything he'd anticipated. Carter turned his attention to Naomi, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Miss Taylor," he said, his tone measured. Or shall I say, Miss Daniels. For the first time, Naomi's composure faltered. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, and she took a small step back. It was a subtle reaction, but Brad and Sarah both noticed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Naomi said, her voice still steady, but with a hint of tension now. Carter ignored her denial, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to Brad, who unfolded it to reveal a photograph. The image was grainy but unmistakable. It was Naomi, or someone who looked eerily like her, standing in what appeared to be an office building. "This," Carter said, gesturing to the photo, "is surveillance footage from 3 days ago. This girl walked into a federal building under a fake name, accessed restricted areas, and left with classified documents. We've been tracking her ever since." Brad's jaw tightened as he looked back at Naomi. "Is this true?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. Her expression had shifted again, her calm facade cracking just enough to reveal the slightest trace of unease. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said finally, "but that's not me." Carter stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "You can deny it all you want, but we've got enough to hold you. And trust me, we will get to the bottom of this." The tension in the air was suffocating now. Brad could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the lines between truth and deception blurring with every passing second. Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes flicking between the officers and the agent. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. Carter's expression didn't change. "We'll see about that." The other officers moved in then, their movements swift and practiced as they placed Naomi in handcuffs. She didn't resist, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of defiance, that suggested this wasn't over. As they led her away, Brad and Sarah exchanged a look, both of them grappling with the same unspoken question. Who was Naomi Taylor, or Daniels, and what had they just gotten themselves into? In the distance, the hum of the airport resumed, but for Brad, it felt like the world had shifted. Nothing about this day or this girl was as it seemed. And deep down, he knew the answers would be far more complicated and dangerous than anything he could have imagined. As Naomi was led away, the weight of the situation settled heavily on Brad's shoulders. He stood frozen for a moment, staring after her, trying to piece together the fragments of the story that had been laid before him. Sarah touched his arm lightly, snapping him out of his thoughts. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, her voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. Brad nodded slowly. "Yeah, something's off. But what are we supposed to do? The FBI's here. This is way out of our jurisdiction now." Sarah looked back toward the direction Naomi had been taken. "Maybe, but that girl, She doesn't strike me as some mastermind criminal. There's more to this, Brad. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but what are we supposed to do? Carter isn't exactly the type to share his playbook. Meanwhile, Naomi was being ushered into a stark interrogation room in the airport's security wing. The sterile walls and bright fluorescent lights made the small space feel even colder. Agent Carter sat across from her, his steely gaze never wavering. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her hands still cuffed in front of her. I hope you've got more than a grainy photo, she said, her voice steady but edged with defiance. Carter placed a thick folder on the table between them. You tell me, he said, flipping it open. Inside were more photos, printed records, and what looked like a map with various locations marked. He slid one photo toward her, a close-up from the same surveillance footage he'd shown Brad and Sarah earlier. Naomi stared at it for a moment before looking up. That's not me. Carter leaned forward. Really? Because this girl matches your description perfectly. Same height, same build, same hair. Even your walk. You expect me to believe this is just a coincidence. Naomi didn't flinch. Believe what you want. It's not me. Carter studied her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. If it's not you, then you won't mind telling me where you were 3 days ago. Naomi hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Carter to pounce. Thought so, he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Let me guess. You don't have an alibi. Naomi's jaw tightened. I don't owe you an explanation, she said firmly. I know my rights. Carter chuckled, a low, humorless sound. You're right, you don't. But the evidence is stacking up against you, and if you don't start talking, this is going to get a whole lot worse for you. Naomi's eyes flickered briefly, a hint of something unreadable passing across her face. But before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Carter frowned and got up to answer it, stepping just outside the room to speak with another agent. Naomi took the opportunity to glance around, her mind racing. She knew she was running out of time. Whatever they thought they had on her, she had to figure out a way to turn the tide. Outside the room, Brad and Sarah lingered near the security wing, their curiosity and concern refusing to let them walk away. This whole thing feels too convenient, Sarah said quietly. I mean, Carter shows up out of nowhere with all this evidence, but we don't even know how they connected her to it in the first place. Brad nodded. Yeah, and Naomi's reactions. She doesn't seem like someone who's guilty. She seems more like she's cornered. Sarah frowned, her mind racing. What if she's being set up? Brad glanced at her, his brow furrowing. Set up? By who? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But think about it. If someone wanted to frame her, they'd only need to make her look guilty enough for the FBI to take over. Once she's out of the way, whoever's really behind this could disappear without a trace. Brad considered her words, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. It wasn't a stretch. He'd seen enough cases to know how easily someone could manipulate the system if they were smart enough. Back in the interrogation room, Carter returned, his expression grim. It seems your story's about to unravel, Miss Daniels, he said, sitting down again. Naomi met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. You're awfully confident for someone who doesn't actually know anything about me. Carter smirked. We know enough, and soon we'll know everything. Naomi didn't respond, but her mind was racing. She could feel the walls closing in, the stakes rising with every passing moment. Whoever had orchestrated this had done their homework, but so had she. As Carter pressed on with his questioning, Brad and Sarah quietly made their way to a nearby monitor room where airport security staff were reviewing surveillance footage. Mind if we take a look? Brad asked, trying to keep his tone casual. The security officer hesitated, but eventually nodded, stepping aside to let them see the screen. What are we looking for? Sarah asked, leaning closer to the monitor. Anything that doesn't add up, Brad replied. For the next several minutes, they watched the footage, their eyes scanning every detail. And then suddenly Sarah froze. Wait, she said, pointing to the screen. Go back. Right there. The officer rewound the footage, and Sarah's eyes narrowed as she studied the scene. It showed a young woman who looked exactly like Naomi walking through the airport, but something about her movements struck Sarah as odd. She's right-handed, Sarah said slowly. Brad frowned. So, Sarah continued, when Naomi was holding her ticket earlier, she used her left hand. And she adjusted her backpack strap with her left hand too. If this girl's right-handed, then she's not Naomi. Brad's eyes widened as the realization hit him. You're right. It's a small detail, but it could be enough to prove she's not the same person. Sarah nodded, her determination growing. We need to get this to Carter. If he's wrong about Naomi, then someone out there is playing a dangerous game. But as they prepared to confront Carter, neither of them could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger, and far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Brad and Sarah rushed down to the surveillance room, their hearts racing. They needed to get this new piece of evidence to Agent Carter. But they also knew that convincing him wouldn't be easy. Carter had come into this situation with his mind made up, and they'd already seen how little he trusted local law enforcement. Still, the video evidence was solid, and if there was even a chance they could prove Naomi's innocence, they had to try. As they made their way to the interrogation room, Brad's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a call from the precinct. Reluctantly, he answered, signaling Sarah to go on without him. Yeah, it's Brad, he said, keeping his voice low. The officer on the other end sounded urgent. We just got a call about Naomi Daniels. Someone claiming to be a lawyer says they have crucial information about her. They're on their way to the airport now. Brad frowned. Did they say who they were? No, but they sounded serious. Thought you'd want to know. All right, keep me updated, Brad said, handing up. The timing was strange, almost too convenient. Whoever this person was, they might hold the key to unraveling the mystery, or they could be part of the setup. Meanwhile, Sarah reached the interrogation room just as Carter was stepping out. He looked irritated, his patience clearly wearing thin. What are you doing here? He snapped, eyeing her suspiciously. I need to show you something, Sarah said firmly, holding up her phone with the video paused on the right-handed Naomi lookalike. This could change everything. Carter's eyes flicked to the screen, his expression unreadable. What is this? Footage from the airport, Sarah explained. The girl you're after. She's right-handed. Naomi's left-handed. It's a small detail, but it proves they're not the same person. Carter stared at the screen for a long moment, his jaw tightening. That's a stretch, he said finally, though his tone lacked the conviction it had earlier. People use their non-dominant hands all the time. Sure, Sarah replied, refusing to back down. But look at the rest of her movements. The way she adjusts her bag, the way she interacts with other people. It's subtle, but it's consistent. This girl is not Naomi. Carter hesitated, the first crack in his confident facade. Before he could respond, another agent approached, whispering something in his ear. Carter's expression darkened, and he gave a curt nod before turning back to Sarah. I'll look into it, he said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't ready to let go of his original theory. Inside the interrogation room, Naomi sat alone, her mind racing. She could sense the tension in the air, the shifting dynamics of the situation. Whoever had orchestrated this was good, too good. But Naomi wasn't just going to sit back and let them win. As she replayed the events of the past few days in her mind, something clicked. A small detail she'd overlooked suddenly stood out, a thread she could pull to unravel the entire setup. She needed to get out of that room and make a call. But with Carter breathing down her neck, it wouldn't be easy. Just then the door opened, and Carter stepped back inside. His expression was harder to read now, a mix of frustration and something else, maybe doubt. Your friends are persistent, he said, sitting down across from her. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Friends. The cops, Carter clarified. They seem to think you're innocent. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. Maybe, because I am. Carter smirked. but it didn't reach his eyes. We'll see about that. As the interrogation continued, Brad caught up with Sarah in the hallway, relaying the call about the mysterious lawyer. "This is getting more complicated by the minute," he muttered. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "Whoever this lawyer is, they might have answers. But we need to stay on top of this. If Carter's wrong, Naomi's life could be destroyed over a mistake, or worse, someone's agenda." Brad's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text with a name and photo. Jonathan Hayes, a high-profile defense attorney known for taking on impossible cases. "Hayes," Brad said, showing Sarah the text. "What's a guy like him doing getting involved in this?" "Maybe Naomi's more connected than we thought," Sarah suggested. "Or someone hired him to cover their tracks," Brad countered. As they debated, a commotion broke out near the entrance to the security wing. They turned to see Jonathan Hayes himself striding in, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. "I'm here to see Naomi Daniels," he announced, his voice calm but firm. Carter appeared moments later, his expression guarded. "And who exactly are you?" Her attorney, Hayes, replied smoothly, holding up his credentials. "And I'd like to speak with my client. Now." The tension in the air was palpable as Carter reluctantly led Hayes to the interrogation room. Brad and Sarah exchanged a look, both of them wondering the same thing. Was Hayes here to help Naomi, or to silence her? Inside the room, Naomi's eyes widened slightly as Hayes entered. She recognized him immediately, though she had no idea why he was there. "Miss Daniels," Hayes said, his tone professional but warm. "I'm here to help." Naomi studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but you better be good, because they've got me backed into a corner." Hayes smiled faintly. "Don't worry. Corners are where I do my best work." As the door closed behind them, the stakes felt higher than ever. Brad and Sarah watched from the hallway, their unease growing. They didn't trust Carter, but they weren't sure they could trust Hayes either. All they knew was that time was running out, and the truth, whatever it was about to come crashing into the open. As the door to the interrogation room closed, Sarah and Brad lingered in the hallway, unease etched into their expressions. Jonathan Hayes was an unknown quantity. His sudden involvement was too convenient to ignore, and they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his presence than met the eye. Brad glanced at his watch, muttering under his breath. "Something about this doesn't sit right. Why would one of the most expensive lawyers in the country show up for a case like this unprompted?" "Unless someone with deep pockets sent him," Sarah replied, her voice low. "But the question is who, and why?" Meanwhile, inside the interrogation room, Hayes wasted no time. He leaned across the table, speaking in a calm but authoritative tone. "Naomi, I need you to tell me everything. Every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem." Naomi hesitated. She didn't fully trust him. How could she? But at this point, she had little choice. Slowly, she began recounting the events leading up to her arrest, her words deliberate and cautious. Hayes listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. But as she spoke, his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Wait," Hayes interrupted. "You said you overheard someone at the cafe mention the name Ambrose. Are you sure?" Naomi nodded, frowning. "Yes, why? Does that mean something to you?" Hayes sat back, his gaze narrowing as he processed the information. "Ambrose isn't just a name. It's a code, part of a network that's been under federal investigation for years. If what you're saying is true, you may have stumbled into something much bigger than you realize." Naomi's stomach tightened. "A network? What kind of network?" Hayes hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say it involves people who operate in the shadows. Powerful people who don't like loose ends. And if you overheard something you weren't supposed to..." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Naomi's arrest wasn't a coincidence. It was a cover-up. Outside, Brad's phone buzzed again. He answered quickly, the voice on the other end speaking so fast he could barely keep up. "Brad, it's July from Dispatch. We just got another call, this one anonymous. They're claiming the real culprit behind the airport incident is boarding a private jet as we speak. The flight's scheduled to leave in 20 minutes. Brad's heart skipped a beat. Did they give any other details? No, just the flight number and the terminal. Brad hung up, turning to Sarah. We've got a problem. Someone's trying to leave the country, and it might be our real suspect. Sarah's eyes widened. Then we need to move. Now. They rushed toward the terminal, their adrenaline spiking. The airport was chaotic, the usual noise and movement amplified by the urgency of their mission. As they neared the private jet section, they spotted a figure moving quickly through the crowd, their face obscured by a hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses. That's got to be them, Brad muttered, quickening his pace. But as they closed the gap, the figure suddenly turned, revealing a face neither of them expected. It wasn't the girl from the footage. It was someone older, someone who looked eerily similar to Naomi, almost like an older sibling or close relative. Sarah's breath caught. Who is that? Before Brad could answer, the figure slipped through a security door, leaving them no choice but to follow. The chase led them into a restricted area of the airport, where the sound of jet engines roared in the distance. The figure darted toward a waiting plane, but just as they reached the steps, a second group of people emerged from the shadows. Brad and Sarah froze as they recognized Agent Carter among them, flanked by several other federal agents. Stand down, Carter shouted, his gun drawn. The hooded figure hesitated, glancing between the agents and the plane. For a moment, it looked like they might surrender, but then, in a sudden burst of motion, they bolted toward the plane. Carter's team moved in, tackling the suspect before they could reach the steps. As the hood was pulled back, the resemblance to Naomi became undeniable. Who are you? Carter demanded, his voice sharp. The suspect said nothing, their jaw set defiantly. But their silence only deepened the mystery, leaving Brad and Sarah reeling. Back in the interrogation room, Hayes finished his conversation with Naomi just as his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. What is it? Naomi asked, her nerves fraying. Hayes stood, his expression unreadable. Something's happening. Stay here. Before Naomi could respond, Hayes left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and the chilling realization that her connection to the unfolding events was far more complicated than she'd imagined. In the hallway, Hayes met Carter, the two men exchanging terse words. Brad and Sarah watched from a distance, their unease growing. Whatever was going on, it was clear that the stakes had just been raised, and the truth was more elusive than ever. The air in the terminal was thick with tension. Carter's team secured the hooded suspect, their every movement deliberate, as though they were handling something more fragile and dangerous than anyone could understand. Brad and Sarah exchanged a quick glance, unsure if they should intervene or step back. But the look in Carter's eyes suggested they weren't just bystanders anymore. They were in this, like it or not. As the suspect was marched toward a waiting black SUV, Brad's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Julie. Asterisk update on Naomi's case. Surveillance footage retrieved from the cafe shows someone planting something in her bag. Sending over now. Asterisk. Brad showed the text to Sarah, who immediately turned her attention to Carter. We've got new footage, she called out, trying to keep up with the group. You might want to see this before anything else happens. Carter paused, his jaw tightening. He motioned for them to follow him back to a secure conference room, where the suspect was already seated, flanked by agents. Hayes was there too, his face unreadable, as though he was piecing something together that didn't yet make sense. The video loaded on the screen, and everyone leaned in. The grainy footage showed Naomi sitting in the cafe, distracted by her phone, as a man in a black baseball cap and sunglasses approached her table. He moved quickly, slipping something into her open bag before disappearing into the crowd. That's him, Naomi said quietly from the corner, having been brought into the room by another officer. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. That's the guy I saw near me at the airport. Carter rewound the footage, narrowing his eyes. We've identified this man before. He's tied to multiple cases involving smuggling and corporate espionage. But why would he target you? Naomi shook her head. I don't know. I don't even know who he is. It was then that the hooded suspect finally spoke, their voice sharp and deliberate. She doesn't know him, but he knows her. And he knows what she's carrying. The room fell silent. Carter turned to the suspect, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. What do you mean? The suspect smirked, a flicker of defiance in their eyes. She's not just some random girl. She's part of something bigger, something she doesn't even realize yet. Naomi's face went pale. What are you talking about? I'm just... me. You think you're just you, the suspect said, leaning forward. But people like me, we've been watching your family for years. Your parents were involved in things they kept hidden. Secrets that people would kill for. Hayes cleared his throat, his voice unusually calm. I need more than vague insinuations. If you know something, now's the time to say it. The suspect hesitated, then let out a sharp breath. Your mother was part of a project. Classified, international. They worked on encryption technology so advanced it could shut down entire networks. She left the project, disappeared, but not before ensuring her work couldn't fall into the wrong hands. She hid the key to it somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look. And guess what? That somewhere turned out to be you. Naomi blinked, her mind racing. That doesn't make any sense. My mom wasn't some secret agent. She was a teacher. The suspect chuckled, their tone dripping with cynicism. Is that what she told you? Sure, maybe she taught a class or two to keep up appearances. But your mother was a genius, and she made sure her legacy wouldn't be exploited. You've been carrying that legacy your whole life, whether you knew it or not. The weight of the revelation hung in the air. Naomi looked to Hayes, then to Carter, desperate for someone to explain what was happening. But before anyone could speak, Brad's phone buzzed again. He read the message aloud. The man in the footage boarded a plane 10 minutes ago. Destination unknown. Carter swore under his breath. We've got to act fast. If he's involved in this, he's not working alone. There's no telling how many people are after her now. Hayes stood, his expression resolute. Naomi stays with me. If what this person is saying is true, she's in more danger than any of us realized. The suspect smirked again. You have no idea. But just as the words left their mouth, the lights in the room flickered, and an alarm blared overhead. Carter's radio crackled to life, the voice on the other end frantic. We've got a breach in Terminal C, multiple unidentified individuals, heavily armed. They're asking for the girl. Chaos erupted as everyone scrambled into action. Carter barked orders, his team mobilizing in seconds. Hayes pulled Naomi close, shielding her as they moved toward the exit. Brad and Sarah followed, their hearts pounding. The situation had spiraled into something far beyond their jurisdiction. But they couldn't walk away now. Not when so many questions remained unanswered. As they reached the security checkpoint, Naomi stopped abruptly, her face suddenly resolute. No, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I'm done running. If they want me, they're going to have to explain why. Naomi, this isn't the time. Hayes began, but she cut him off. It's my life, and I deserve to know the truth. Before anyone could argue, Naomi stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the approaching figures. Carter's team formed a protective line, their weapons drawn, as the tension in the room reached its breaking point. And then, just as the first figure came into focus, Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her breath catching at the sight of an unfamiliar number and a single message. Asterisk, there, lying to you. Call me. Mom. Asterisk. The world seemed to freeze as Naomi stared at the words, her mind racing with possibilities. Could it really be her mother? And if it was, what else had been kept from her? Before she could decide what to do, the figures stepped into the light, and Naomi realized she wasn't looking at strangers. She was looking at faces she knew, faces she trusted. And that was when she understood the real betrayal was only just beginning.